Today, a judge will say 4 words that change my life. Restated trust, invalid. How I got here. That's the story. At my husband's memorial, my son thanked the woman everyone called his artistic partner Sloan People, gripped her hands like she'd saved him. They looked at me like I might spill on the carpet. The next morning, an estate attorney slid a glossy folder across a table. Per the restated trust, Miss Sloan Avery is the primary beneficiary. Downtown condo, island cottage, investment accounts, even the studio. Me? Personal effects. A scarf, a plant, not a roof. Grief got quiet. I didn't. Back home, a silent metronome on the piano kept staring at me. At 1:12 a.m., I pried open the bass. A tiny brass key fell into my palm, and 3 penciled words in my husband's hand. Bainbridge. Box 317. If the will was truly restated, why hide a key? With a forensic accountant and a lawyer who hates lies, I opened that box. Inside, my name on the original will, and a letter from my husband, written before last summer's revision. Capacity, undue influence, a non-profit with a board of one, and money flowing exactly where love shouldn't go. They thought they'd taken everything, until I walked into court with the truth. Tempo is consent. They tried to rush me. I chose the beat. I stood at the back of the hall with a stack of memorial programs pressed to my ribs, like I could keep everything from falling to the floor if I just held on hard enough. The lilies at the edge of the stage were the kind people send when they want to be remembered for sending them. The conductor's stool sat empty under a hard circle of light. The rain had followed people in on their coats and hair, and the smell of wet wool floated over the room. The music director called for silence. My son, Caleb, stood at the podium the way you stand on the lip of a pool when you don't know if the water is warm or freezing. He cleared his throat, and the microphone picked it up like a reprimand. "There's someone here who carried my father when he was tired," he said. His voice was steady because he has my ability to hold a tone even when it hurts. Someone who became true family. I thought I knew where that sentence was going. I tightened my grip on the programs and let myself imagine for a small, foolish second that it might be me. That he might say my name to a room full of people who used to think I belonged beside his father instead of behind him. I let the imagined sound warm me, the way you let a beam of sun through a cloud touch your face before it vanishes. He looked to the front row. "Sloan," he said, "thank you." There are moments when the air leaves a room and the floor keeps pretending it can hold you up. A few people turned to see Sloan stand. She pressed a tissue to the corner of an eye that never smeared. She wore a deep emerald dress that knew it was looked at. She pressed fingertips to her collarbone in that way actresses do when they receive awards. The applause was quick and expensive, a thin shimmer of sound that told me who these people believed we were. I kept handing out programs with a smile that felt like it belonged in a museum. After, when the crowd folded itself into small groups and the rain began to tattoo the windows again, people took Sloan's hands and squeezed them for too long. "He adored you," they repeated. "You kept him going." They looked at me the way you look at someone who could spill something on the carpet. Caleb came down from the stage and hugged me in a way that kept the rest of his body from agreeing. "You okay, Mom?" he asked, not looking at my face. "I'm vertical," I said. "That's the baseline today." He nodded and was already looking past me. Sloan drifted to him the way a violin line drifts above a melody, pretending it isn't asking for all the attention in the room. She laid 2 fingers on his sleeve. He leaned down so she could whisper something, and he laughed a short, relieved laugh. If I hadn't carried him on my hip through fevers and night terrors, and the first day of kindergarten when he wouldn't let go of my scarf, I might have thought it was a nice sound. When the last of the umbrellas had closed and the ushers began pulling the vases toward the side door, I stacked redundant programs and smoothed their corners like that would keep the words from changing. "He was brilliant," the music director said to me as he shrugged into a coat with dark water blooming on the shoulders. "Brilliance is costly." He had the practiced sorrow of a person who has spoken at more memorials than he will attend. It always was, I said. At home, my house inhaled my loneliness and gave it a room, then another. I hung my coat on the hook that Leonard, he had trained people to call him by the name that made programs and playbills feel important, always used. His scarf hung there too, the one I knit during the winter when we had more snow than money and the neighbor's persimmon tree dropped fruit like burning suns. I made tea and carried it to the piano because that's where my hands go when my head won't mind me. The metronome sat on the lid like a little wooden obelisk. Its brass pendulum pointed down. The number 72 stared up at me. The resting pulse he believed in. I wound it out of habit. The key turned and the box groaned and then nothing. No tick, no sound. Just the rain against the glass and the old house making old house sounds among the bones of the heating ducts. In the morning, I sat in an office that smelled like old toner and new bills. The framed print of Mount Rainier on the far wall hung half an inch off level. The estate attorney had a gentle voice that wore a knot of apology like a tie. He slid a stiff folder to the center of the glossy table and tapped it with a chewed pen. Per the restated trust, he said, looking at his notes like they might defend him if I lunged across the table. The primary beneficiary is Ms. Sloane Avery. The condo downtown, the island cottage, the investment accounts and instruments titled in Mr. Bryce's name, and the contents of the studio are to be transferred in accordance with Schedule A, restated, I asked. It's a word you think will mean a thing, it doesn't. Last summer, he said, a revision to align with Mr. Bryce's philanthropic goals. And what do you call me? I asked. Am I a philanthropic goal? He held his breath between words. You are provided for. There is a spousal support section and a survivorship clause regarding personal effects. Personal effects, I repeated, a librarian shelving a phrase back where it belonged. Do you mean his scarf? Or the plant he always forgot to water and I always revived? Which of those keeps the roof over my head? Caleb sat on the other side of the table and stared at the same grain in the wood like it would open. He laced and unlaced his fingers and finally said, Dad wanted his music funded. He wanted his legacy to live where his music lived. Does it live in that woman's closet? I asked, surprised by the shape of my own voice. Mom, he said, the syllable heavy with decades of stops and starts. Sloane's attorney wasn't there. This was just the reading. But her thank you smile was still in the room, hovering at mouth height. When it was over, the estate attorney slid a photocopied packet toward me, and I slid it into my bag, the clasp clicking like something old closing. That night, I wiped the kitchen counter until the rag went cold in my hand. Every object in the house had a memory attached, like a price tag. The chip tile by the stove looked like Idaho because the day Caleb was 10, he dropped the cast iron skillet and cried about geography. The dent in the hallway baseboard was from the winter. Leonard brought the Christmas tree inside alone and refused to let me help because he said men make better decisions without commentary. The piano's middle C had a slightly nasal quality because he'd said he liked it that way, so I'd learned to stop hearing it. The metronome pulled my eye like a word on the wrong shelf. I picked it up. It was heavy for a hollow thing. I turned it over, and the felt feet were worn to a thread. The seam along the bottom felt like a scar under a shirt. I pressed my thumbnail to it. It gave a little, and then held. I set it down because I didn't trust the strength of my hands. I made myself sleep, or something that put hours between me and the day. In the morning, Gloria came by with soup because she is the kind of neighbor who doesn't ask whether you're hungry before putting a spoon in your hand. Her raincoat had daisies on it that were so bright they looked like an argument with the weather. She stood in my doorway and looked past me into the hallway like a person checking the sky for breaks where light might get in. He was brilliant, she said, handing me a container warm enough to believe in. Brilliance makes a lot of laundry, I said. I had never said it out loud before. The relief in my mouth made me want to sit down. Gloria stepped inside, made tea the way you make tea in a house where the owner has forgotten how. She glanced at the piano. I saw her here last spring, she said carefully, like she had learned not to place anything heavy on shelves she didn't own. Early mornings. Twice, maybe 3 times. I told myself they were rehearsing because I like sleeping at night. I don't think I know what close means anymore, I said. She squeezed my hand until I remembered it was mine. Find a good lawyer, she said, and somebody who loves spreadsheets more than people. I thought I wasn't allowed to fight grief with paper, I said. Paper outlives flowers, she said, and it doesn't rot on your porch. When she left, the rain made a polite sound on the steps. I stared at the metronome until it stared back. At 1:12 a.m., I fetched a butter knife from the drawer and set the metronome on a towel so I could pretend I wasn't prying a grave open. The bass moved with a faint sigh. I tipped the thing into my hand, expecting dust. A small brass key fell into my palm and hit like a coin into a fountain. It was the kind of key banks keep in trays and loan to you with a smile that says, "We're watching." Inside the bass, on the raw wood, in faint pencil and the hand I used to read when he wrote notes on the backs of envelopes, were 3 words. Bainbridge. Box 317. I held the key in my fist like a tiny, very old heartbeat. Then I reassembled the box, set it back on the piano like nothing had happened, and slept with the key under my pillow because I am not entirely made of reason. Bainbridge is a ferry ride and an earlier version of yourself away. The morning air tasted like a decision you've already made. The bank had the kind of carpeting that makes you walk quieter. The woman at the desk wore a name badge and an expression that said her life was made of helping and saying no. "I'm here to access box 317, I said, placing the key on the counter like I was laying down an argument. "Are you a signer on the box?" she asked, hands folded. "My husband was," I said. "He died last month. His name is Leonard Bryce. I have the key, and I have identification, and I have a lifetime of doing what he didn't have time to think about." "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, and the words were smooth pebbles she had rolled between her fingers all week. "We'll need either authorization from another signer or a court order to drill." There are buildings where the only correct answer is paperwork. I picked up the key, put it in the small inner pocket of my bag that once held snacks when Caleb was small and life was survival by Ziploc, and walked out into the mist. On the ferry back, a child pointed at a gull and said its name incorrectly. His mother didn't correct him. I liked her immediately. "You'll need people who don't flinch at paper," Gloria had said. So I called a woman whose niece I'd helped get into the right reading group back when my life happened at the school library. The niece had grown up to be a forensic accountant who liked puzzles that didn't fit on coffee tables. "My friend Priya," the niece had said once on a porch crowded with potted basil, "can smell a bad balance sheet across a room." The cafe Priya chose didn't believe in sugar and served coffee that could make an old woman confess. Priya wore a sweater the color of rain and a silver ring shaped like an ampersand. "I read the trust summary the attorney gave you," she said when introductions were done. She set a tablet on the table and turned it like a map. "The summer restatement smells like a rush job. Rushed means messy. Messy means useful." "He was messy last summer," I said. "He called the dishwasher the piano once and then smiled like a boy asking me to keep a secret." "Did he have a diagnosis?" Priya asked, hands still, voice careful. "No one wanted to name it," I said. "We live in a city that has names for rain, but my husband wouldn't let a doctor put a word on whatever was happening to his mind." "Capacity matters," she said. "So does undue influence. If someone you love is losing the speed of their thinking, and a person who has the most to gain helps them, that's a story judges understand even if they never played in an orchestra." I told her about the key inside the metronome and the words on the wood. She took one slow breath, a metronome set to sanity. "With counsel and a friendly bank manager, we can access the box," she said. "I work with an estates litigator who knows Bainbridge branch staff. Her name is Victoria Chen. She is allergic to bullshit." "Allergies run in my family," I said. The vault was colder than I expected. The manager was a woman with haircut to get things done. She double-checked Victoria's letter like she would check her own name if you asked her to spell it. She led us past a door that told you weren't invited and into a room the size of a large bathroom if your bathroom had no towels and a single table under fluorescent honesty. Victoria turned the key the way a person turns a page they have waited years to read. The attendant slid the long drawer out like a tongue and left us alone. Inside was an archival envelope, cloth-bound and tied with ribbon the color of nothing. There was a smaller envelope with my name written in Leonard's precise little print that had always made me think of leaves. There was a leather folder with a notary ribbon and a small plastic drive in a Ziploc bag labeled in block letters. His, as if he wanted to make sure someone knew it belonged to him. Hall interview, Ralston. My fingers shook. Priya's did not. Victoria untied the ribbon with the competence of a person who files time for a living. The original will name me primary beneficiary, personal representative, and executor. It established a scholarship in Leonard's father's name at the public high school, where he'd learned to play with a rental violin and a teacher who told him to leave his anger in the practice room. It had been notarized 8 years earlier in a bank that had since changed logos. The restated trust from last summer redirected assets to a nonprofit called Avery Arts Initiative, designed to be managed by Sloan. A board of 1. No published tax returns yet. Priya's mouth pressed into a line so straight it looked like all the other lines were misbehaving. "Filed 2 months after your anniversary," she said, flicking through records. "What did you get for your anniversary last year?" "A plant," I said. "He said it would outlive us if I stopped overwatering it. I cried in the pantry for exactly 4 minutes and then made him the pasta he liked." Victoria touched the notary seal like pianists touch keys they love. "We can challenge the restatement on capacity and undue influence," she said. "We'll need medical notes. And we'll need to show that the nonprofit is less of a charity and more of a personal wallet with a mission statement." "Open his letter," Priya said quietly. The paper trembled. He had written like he spoke when we were alone, and there was nothing to conduct but our lives. "Elena," it began, "if you found this, I was braver in paper than in person. I'm sorry for everything I made you hold while I performed at kindness. Sloan is a force. I mistook it for rescue. There were days last spring I could not keep time. Ralston said mild cognitive impairment, and I said not yet. I wrote this will years back in a mood that felt like truth. If summer me chose otherwise, ask winter me who he was. Forgive me if you can. Forgive me if you can. As if forgiveness were a trick you could make with your hands. As if saying it made the act lighter. We filed. The letters I signed were long-boned and full of nouns. Sloane's attorney responded with the kind of paper you send when you have money and think that means you're right. They threatened injunctions and accused me of poisoning the city's memory of a man the city agreed to love. She will seek a temporary restraining order, Victoria said after reading, because people like to put metal bars across doors when they hear. Someone walking up the driveway. Caleb called that evening with a voice I didn't recognize. "This isn't you," he said without context. "Then who am I?" I asked. "The woman who paid for reeds and winter coats and whispered you through nightmares while your father practiced until midnight? Or the woman who held her breath so long at other people's dinners, her lips forgot their color? Pick a version, Caleb. I will be it if you can just tell me which one allows me to keep the house." "She made him happy," he said, and the words slipped like oil. "Why are you trying to take away his happiness?" "I am trying not to be erased," I said. "There's a difference." "It's a difference you'll learn when the first woman you love tells you to take off your shoes before you walk across everything she's cleaned." He hung up. The click was soft, and the room amplified it. That night, the power left us mid-sentence. The house sighed and let the dark in. I lit the fat white candle someone had wrapped in a glittery ribbon that shed everywhere and set it on the piano. It cast a small circle of light that made the metronome glow like something religious. I heard the house, like a body, at rest. In the light, on my phone, a voice memo I didn't remember glowed up from a list of grocery notes and reminders to schedule dental cleanings. Tempo didn't let them rush you. I pressed play and Leonard's voice came into the room, late night soft with the piano in the background like a considerate friend. Tempo is consent, he said, and laughed at himself because he liked the sound of a thought. If they rush you, it isn't your song. I pressed the back of my hand to my mouth and let sound come out of me without a word attached. Then I put the phone on the piano and pressed play again. The first hearing was a small thing that stole a whole morning. The judge wore her hair like a person who didn't need help with it. She had the calm of a woman who has been lied to by experts. "Counsel," she said, and kept her voice level like a metronome everyone in the room could hear. Sloane's attorney stood and made a clean speech about legacies and donor intent and a world-class arts initiative that would attract national recognition. He said my challenge was a bitter attempt to rewrite a man's desires. He didn't look at me because I wasn't a person he needed to convince. Victoria stood and spoke without adjectives. She talked about capacity and timing and how the restatement came at the end of months, in which Leonard struggled with short-term memory and language. She mentioned the non-profit's Board of One. She laid a photocopy of a bank statement on the document camera and traced a line with her finger. The Avery Arts Initiative, paying consulting fees to Sloane's LLC in sums that suggested the consulting might be second jobs performed by stacks of cash late at night. The judge did not sigh. I decided then that she would be good at weather. We left the courthouse into a rain that had decided to be honest. The sky was the color of an apology you never intend to keep. On the steps, people in suits arranged their faces into questions and moved them past other people's faces as if answers were contagious. "Prepare for depositions," Victoria said under her breath, "and let Priya do what Priya does." What Priya does is turn numbers into a story you can read without your lips moving. She sat with me at my kitchen table for hours while rain made a steady sentence along the gutters, and the furnace ticked into life like a very old clock. We went through emails that never used the words anyone was looking for. We searched public filings, returns that weren't yet public, and the ghost prints left by people who think starting a charity is a clever way to get your needs met without calling them yours. We printed copies and layered them on the table where Caleb used to spread homework like he wanted to put the entire world in order by Wednesday. Priya sketched a timeline with a pencil, erasing carefully so the paper stayed smooth. "Here," she said, pointing. "Diagnosis notes. Here, board filing. Here, trust restatement. Here, the condo purchased in the nonprofit's name, leased to a program director whose social security number is attached to a company Sloane also owns. This is not philanthropy. This is a secret with a letterhead. I met Dr. Ralston in an office where the paintings looked like feelings you're not allowed to have at work. He had the kind of eyes that made people tell him things they had rehearsed not to say. He chose his words like he was carrying something delicate across a room. When your husband came to me last spring, he said, he was charming because he knew charm had worked. He compensated beautifully on structured tests because he understood how to turn everything into an exercise and he liked winning. But his wife, he looked at me the way a person looks at a lighthouse when the rain is strong, saw that he was losing time between thoughts. He mixed metaphors and called objects by their cousins. He could hold a conversation like a champion, but he forgot what he had decided the morning before. Mild cognitive impairment is the phrase. It is a warning label. It can behave for a while and then it does not. Capacity is not a cliff. It is a shoreline that retreats while you are still standing on it. He agreed to testify. He gave Victoria the notes he had written in language that a judge could hear without thinking she was in a different profession. Caleb didn't come around much. When he did, he kept his eyes on his phone like he was looking for a better version of the life that had insisted on being here. "You understand how this looks, right?" he said in my kitchen as he accepted a glass of water he didn't sip. "Like you're trying to steal Dad's legacy from the work." "From the city." "What did I steal, exactly?" I asked. "When I stayed home with a fever to make sure there was something green next to the chicken on your father's plate because he refused to eat, vegetables that didn't look like they had come straight off a magazine page. When I took an extra shift at the library to cover the copay for the therapist who taught you to breathe into a paper bag and call it oxygen. Did I steal the mortgage payment from the light bill? Could you point to the thief? Mom. Don't tell me I'm not being myself," I said, and I felt my voice steady the way you steady a glass you're about to pour. "I am being the self who learned that love is not a license to remove a person from her own life." Caleb set the glass down carefully. He left. The door clicked. The silence stayed and didn't apologize. There are places a person goes to feel something outside their house. I went to the public market and drifted past tourists who bought fish like they were purchasing a story to tell their coworker on Monday. I stood near the row of flowers and pretended to consider tulips. I watched a couple argue about honey sticks in low voices, kind and exasperated at once. I walked to the waterfront and let the sound of the ferry be my pulse. A man played a guitar badly and meant it. A woman in a red hat cried without wiping her face. I thought about how many people were built out of things they never said. When the deposition started, the conference room had a bowl of candy at the end of the table that no one touched. Sloan wore a suit the color of calm. She sat up straight because people who have trained their bodies to carry expensive instruments can sit for hours without complaining. She answered questions with words that had been washed and pressed. "I was Mr. Bryce's artistic consultant," she said. "We worked closely. We discussed donors and programming and ways to bring community into rooms that needed it." "Did you discuss his estate plan?" Victoria asked. "I'm not a lawyer," she said, and smiled with only part of her mouth. "Did you accompany him to his attorney's office last summer?" Victoria asked. "We had lunch at a place nearby," she said. "He had a meeting. I had a salad." "Do you recognize these board minutes?" Priya slid papers across the table like a dealer who knows which card you're waiting for. Sloan glanced down. "I rarely took meeting notes," she said. "I asked a volunteer to assist." "I'm not sure what that is." "Your initials are on the bottom right," Priya said. Sloan smiled. "I initial a lot of things." The day ended in a hallway with bad lighting. I stood by the window and watched a man across the street try to parallel park. He gave up and drove around the block. I respected his method. Sloan came out with her attorney and stopped far enough away to be decent and close enough to be cruel if she wanted. She looked at me with eyes that could read rooms. "You don't have to be this kind of person," she said softly. "What kind?" I asked. "The kind who wins and still loses," she said. "I was that kind most of my life," I said. "I'm trying something else." In the weeks before the hearing, the house learned to hold my breathing. I found the bottom of drawers where paper clips live like eels. I found a photograph from a summer decades ago when Leonard smiled the way he only smiled when music came through him, like weather. We had been young and poor, and I had been certain that a person who loved sound so much would never learn to lie in silence. I tucked the photo under the metronome the way you tuck a child into bed when he insists he isn't tired. On a day that believed in rain, I stood in my kitchen and listened to the email chime 3 times in slow succession. Priya had sent a summary that made me want to send her a cake. Victoria had filed motions that used words like constructive trust and undue influence with the casual confidence of someone who has worked hard enough to sound casual. Dr. Ralston had attached an addendum that explained how even people who perform public life beautifully can be slipping in private, and how slipping is not consent. I took the ferry to the island cottage because I wanted to remember why any of this mattered beyond papers. The cottage smelled like cedar and our old life. I opened windows and let air right over rooms that had memorized arguments. I found the knot in the floor that looks like an eye and told it what I was afraid of. I swept the porch. I sat on the step until my back hurt. Then I lay on the rug that had outlived the dog and cried the way the body cries when no one is taking attendance. When it was time to go, I locked the door and touched the brass knob because it had always been honest. In court, on the day that would be a story later, the judge wore the same expression she had for every day of her job. A reporter in the back row scrolled through her phone like the decision might be there already. My son sat behind Sloane, not directly behind her, a few seats over, like he wanted to convince himself later that he had not sided with anyone at all. He had shaved too closely, and there was an angry place under his jaw where skin had been nicked. Victoria stood and made the room feel like a room you could live in. She laid out the story without adjectives, the original will, the letter in the box, the restatement in summer, the nonprofit's board of one, the consulting transfers that paid an apartment's rent, and then some. Priya took the stand and turned bank statements into a story I might have loved if it weren't mine. Dr. Ralston spoke softly and the room leaned in. Sloane's attorney attacked process and pretended that facts are rude. He said the late Mr. Bryce was a genius, and the law should not punish genius for choosing beauty. He produced a photograph from a donor gala where Leonard smiled and lifted a glass and looked like health. He asked if people who look like that can be broken. The judge stared at him long enough that he sat down. There was a moment when Victoria played the voice memo. Leonard's voice came into the fluorescent light and spoke about tempo and consent. It wasn't proof of anything except the sound of a person I loved, reminding me to be myself, but the room felt it. You can always feel someone who was brave enough to speak after midnight. When the judge ruled, she didn't change her tone. She was a woman telling the truth the way you tell a child not to touch a hot pan. This court finds the July restatement invalid for lack of testamentary capacity and undue influence, she said. The original will is admitted to probate. A constructive trust is imposed for assets transferred under the invalid instrument. The nonprofit known as Avery Arts Initiative is enjoined from further disbursements pending forensic accounting. Council will confer on a schedule for the accounting and fees. Sloane made a sound I had heard only once before, the day a string snapped in rehearsal and the room stopped moving. Caleb did not look at me. He stared at his hands. The judge stood and left the bench. Everyone in the room waited a beat to remember they were allowed to move. After, in the hallway, people made faces that meant congratulations and also meant, please don't tell me anything that will make me late for lunch. Victoria squeezed my elbow. Priya smiled with her eyes because her mouth wasn't a place to put joy in a courthouse. Sloane passed close enough that her perfume reminded me of mint tea we used to drink on summer nights when the world felt possible. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at Caleb. She looked at the glass and saw herself. The accounting took time because time is what people who have done wrong buy with their money. Priya and a second accountant followed payments through the maze Sloane had built. The nonprofit had paid for clothes that were called costumes, and flights that were called outreach, and a condo that was called housing for visiting artists, and then had only one visitor. The numbers lined up like a confession. Victoria filed a motion for sanctions with a face you would let deliver your child. There were days when I woke and the house felt heavier than it had any right to be. I would walk through rooms and touch the tops of door frames like I used to when I was a girl to prove I was growing. I would boil water for tea and forget to pour it. I would read a paragraph and forget the beginning before I reached the end. Grief made me clumsy, and then boredom made me mean. I apologized to the air 3 times in a week. On one of those days, Gloria came over with the kind of bread you slice too thick and sat at my table while I was unkind to the butter. You always said you liked fiction because it told the truth slant, she said. So tell your own truth that way. You're allowed to be the narrator of your life. You don't owe anyone a preface. When the refunds and transfers were ordered and the condo was sold and the checks were cut back to the estate, I did not cheer. I stood in my kitchen and looked at the chip in the tile that still looked like Idaho, and I rested my hand on the counter because it was where I have put my hands for most of my adult life, and it had not complained. The house felt lighter. I didn't. Not yet. Caleb called one evening while the light was doing the thing it does in this city, where it hovers at the edge of the water like a thought you haven't said. I let it ring twice, not as a game, but as a reminder I had a choice. "Mom," he said, "can we talk?" "We're talking," I said, and heard how sharp it was and softened my mouth. "I found some texts," he said. "Dad sent them to me last year, and I didn't want to look." I looked. He was scared. He said he forgot how to count in. He said he knew he should talk to you, but he was ashamed of how much he needed help. "I'm sorry." He exhaled like a person who has been underwater. I chose the version that let me keep my father a little longer. "It wasn't fair. It was human," I said. "I was human too. It wasn't always pretty." We met on the ferry because it forces you to move forward and backward at once. The wind made us strangers for 2 minutes, and then it didn't. We sat on the upper deck and watched the city become a postcard in slow motion. Caleb told me he had called Sloan and told her he would testify in the accounting if he had to. He told me he remembered the Idaho on the kitchen floor and had laughed about geography in his apartment alone until he cried. "I think I forgot you were a person," he said. "I thought you were the thing that kept us from drowning because you never let us drown, and I got arrogant and stopped looking." "I like being a person," I said. "It's noisy in here, but it's home." In the months after, I met with the principal at the high school where Leonard first learned to hold a bow properly and not like a weapon. We sat in his office under a badly framed pink drawing of a tuba, and I signed papers that would start the scholarship fund in Leonard's father's name. The letters looked right in a way I could feel in my chest. We took a photograph I will not show anyone, and I asked if I could speak for 2 minutes at the first awards ceremony. The principal said yes and showed me his shoes because they were new and his wife had chosen them. I liked him immediately. On a Sunday that believed it was June, I walked downtown slowly enough to notice how many dogs there are in this city and how many couples touch elbows as if their elbows had signed a treaty. I went to the auditorium where the youth orchestra was tuning. The sound is the same wherever you go, chaos pretending it's being helpful. The conductor tapped his baton against the stand and the room calmed. I took a program at the door because I still like holding paper when I sit. A girl with red hair sat next to her mother in the row ahead of me and whispered the names of the instruments like she was learning a language she already spoke. The music was clean and a little terrified and completely sufficient. In a piece I didn't recognize, the first violins raced each other the way children race home in the rain. I felt something in my chest loosen. I let it. Later, at the ceremony, I stood at a lectern that had been polished with a rag that had lived a long life. I didn't say what I planned to. I said what showed up. Tempo belongs to you. I told a room full of children who were mostly taller than I am. I loved a man who forgot that, and I loved a boy who learned it, and now I love myself enough to tell you to keep your own. If someone tries to rush you, remember that a song is still yours even when you play it slowly. The world will survive your patience. Afterward, a girl with a braid I envied shook my hand and told me she had a metronome at home that ticked too loud. "Put it on a dish towel," I said, and she laughed the way you laugh when adults remember practical things. I went home to a house that had learned new sounds. The fridge hum felt friendlier. The radiators chattered the way they had the first winter we lived here and thought we'd made a mistake we couldn't afford to fix. I set the metronome to 72 and let it tick for a minute, and then I stopped it because I wanted to hear my own breathing. I opened the letter again because sometimes that is the way you forgive a person who didn't ask properly. Gloria came over with strawberries that looked like real strawberries and not like the idea of strawberries costumed for Instagram. We sat on the step with bowls in our laps. She asked me if I'd kept any of his sweaters. I said yes, the navy one that made him look like a nicer version of himself. She nodded. "I I kept my Peter's Sunday shirts, she said. I wore one once to clean the garage and I felt better afterward, like I had used the last of him in a way that suited us both. We didn't cry. We ate the fruit and watched a boy on a scooter fall and stand and ride again, like the future was a game he intended to win. A letter arrived from the court with numbers that let me sleep. The house, the accounts, the things that keep water hot and lights on, returned in words and signatures and a stamp that read, "Entered." Victoria called to tell me about a check that would pay her team. "I know you're going to say thank you," she said, "so I will say you're welcome first." "You were weather," I said, "the kind that keeps a roof honest." Priya sent an email with a photograph of a spreadsheet she'd printed for the joy of it. "I have a confession," she wrote. "Your son sent me a note. He said thank you for being the person his mother could be with without explaining herself." I printed the email and put it in the drawer with the pencils and the battery charger because it felt like a kind of power. I began walking in the mornings before my neighborhood remembered itself. There's a dog on the corner who disrespects leashes and a man who waters his yard with an attention I reserve for moods. I bought a pair of shoes that did not apologize for their height. I stood in front of a mirror and cut my hair myself because I wanted to look like a person who acts. I made soup and oversalted it and ate it anyway. I opened a savings account with my name alone and moved numbers into it that would have made the version of me from 10 years ago faint in the grocery store between cereal and soup. On the anniversary of the memorial, I went back to the hall with a single lily because I am a cliché when no one is looking. The building smelled like dust and months. I stood in the doorway and let the room be a room. In the corner, stacked against a wall, were music stands with a few programs caught under their feet. One of them had Leonard's name on it in type I'd chosen because he wouldn't pick fonts. I slipped the program into my bag and walked out into the kind of light that makes windows look clean even when they aren't. On a Tuesday that pretended to be Friday, Sloane called. I stared at her name on my phone long enough to learn what it looked like upside down. I answered because I am not a coward even when I should be. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," she said after the kind of silence we used to put between movements. "Not for everything. I don't have it in me, but for some. For the way he used you and I let him. For the way I used him and called it love because it was what I could afford. I can accept some," I said. "It's bulk apologies I can't store." "He was slipping," she said. "I didn't want to name it because naming is glue." I kept thinking if we went faster, we would outrun it. "Tempo is consent," I said, surprised at the gentleness of my mouth. "You can't make it yours by counting louder." "Are you happy?" she asked, and the question was so out of place I almost laughed. "I am alive," I said. "That's the more honest word for this season." "That's something," she said. "I don't know how to want anything small enough to get." "I hope you learn," I said. "The world is more bearable when what you want fits in your hands." After we hung up, I put my phone in the drawer with the charging cords and the small things we don't know where to keep. I stood by the piano and ran my finger along the edge that has always been a little rough. I set the metronome to 60, then 80, then 72 again. I let it tick for 4 bars, and then I stopped it because I could. The first scholarship ceremony happened on a day when rain made promises and kept none. The auditorium filled with families who smelled like shampoo and nerves. I wore a jacket that had belonged to my mother because it made me feel like 2 women standing up at once. The principal introduced me as a member of our community, and I heard the words land in my chest. I read the name of the first recipient, a boy whose hair refused to be tamed. He shook my hand with both of his and whispered, "Thank you," in a way that told me he understood he wasn't just taking money, he was taking a baton and agreeing to count. I smiled at him the way I smiled at my son when we left the inhaler on the kitchen counter and had to go back, calm like the world is made to be survived. At home that night, I sat by the window with the lights off. Seattle knows how to be beautiful when you think you don't deserve it. The street shone like someone had polished it. A man in a hoodie walked a dog that tried to make friends with a puddle. Somewhere, on the other side of the glass, someone practiced scales badly and the notes floated across the block like evidence of trying. I thought of the early days when Leonard and I shared a mattress we bought used and the springs sang uninvited harmonies. I thought of the late days when he asked me to find his glasses while he was wearing them, and we laughed because the alternative was crying. I thought of the middle, the long, flat gold of an ordinary marriage that keeps the world turning because someone is buying milk and someone is paying the light bill, and both of them forget to thank the other until there's a funeral program with a name on it. I took a breath that belonged to me. I said out loud to the room that has heard all my talking, "I forgive you," and I didn't say who I meant. I watched my breath fog the glass in a small oval and then clear. I stood, walked to the piano, set the metronome to 72, and let it tick. The sound counted out a future I felt in my bones. I went to the Bainbridge Bank once more with a bouquet and a tin of cookies that taste like butter when butter is honest. The manager laughed and took the cookies and told me no one ever says thank you to a vault. I thanked the vault anyway. I went to the island cottage and repotted a plant that had lived loyally. I bought paint and covered the wall where a stain refused to accept its age. I left a note in the kitchen drawer for no one in particular in case the house forgets. "If you find this," I wrote, "remember to put the metronome on a towel so the tick sounds kinder." Caleb started coming around again without trying to fix the air before he sat down. He brought over a woman named Mara, who laughed like a non-alarm bell and said she liked my kitchen because it felt like a place where people could be wrong without losing their chairs. I made pasta and put too much garlic in it, and no one complained. After dinner, while we were washing dishes in the pattern, people who love each other learn by standing next to each other, Caleb picked up the metronome and set it down again. "Do you ever wish it ticked louder?" he asked. "Sometimes," I said. "But then I decide I am the tick." Mara smiled and handed me the towel. "I like that," she said. "I might steal it." "Take it," I said. "Stories are better when they get used." In the fall, the court issued a final order that would read as dull as wallpaper to people who hadn't lived inside it. The nonprofit was dissolved. The accounts were reconciled. Fees were awarded. Paper finished what people started. I put the order in a folder, and then I put the folder on a shelf where I keep joy. It seemed like a small rebellion, and I am not above being petty when no one is harmed. A letter came for me, care of the hall, with a signature I didn't recognize. It was from a woman who had taught Leonard music in junior high. She was 80 if a day and wrote with loops so big they looked like generosity. "He was late," she wrote, "to every class. He was hungry and he acted like I should be glad he'd arrived. I told him I was, but that the music wouldn't wait forever. He learned to be on time for the thing that mattered. I am glad you made the music wait for you this time." I cried in that old, clean way you cry when someone older points at you with love. I started volunteering one afternoon a week at the library after swearing I'd never alphabetize for free again. The library is where I make sense of time. Children run through categories that adults resist. I shelved books with the satisfaction of a person who knows exactly where one thing belongs. A boy handed me a book about trains and asked if the word locomotive had bones. I said yes, because in my world, words are skeletons we hang meaning on. He nodded and went to build something out of wooden tracks that didn't fit until he told them they did. My hair has grown out in uneven waves I didn't choose. I look like a woman who laughs into her hands sometimes and doesn't bother other times. I sleep on the left side of the bed because it's where I always slept. The right side is still his because I can be sentimental without being foolish. I keep his scarf on the hook and wear it when the air tells me to be very kind to myself. I stopped apologizing to chairs when my leg bumps them. I still apologize to people more than I should. I am working on it. On the day that feels like the real end of this story and maybe the beginning of another, I make coffee. I drink slowly enough to be accused of doing it wrong. I stand by the window and watch the mail carrier put someone else's catalog in my box. I go outside in socks and exchange it. The mail carrier calls me by name, and I like it too much. I walk back in and touch the metronome as I pass because it has become a habit. I set it to 72 and listen. The house keeps time. So do I. And because I understand now that it matters to say things out loud so the air can hold them too, I tell the room what I know, what I have always known but finally earned. My life did not end at a memorial. It did not begin there either. It continued. It turned a page. It learned a new measure. It took a breath and counted itself in. I am not a conductor, and I don't need to be. I am the person who decides when to begin, and I begin.